Timeline, the history of WWE, was allowing me to use legends of the sport that did not fit into the narrow confines of the prerequisites for guest booker and U-shoot. Anyone hired for those two shows would have to have been a booker or a controversial figure, respectively. Now legends like Superstar Graham had a spot on KC programming. Larry Zbyszko is a great example of that. I don't know what show would have worked for a guy like Larry except Timeline. Larry was in the hottest feud of 1980 in the WWE with Bruno Sammartino and, based on his turning on the Federation's hero, became one of the hottest heels there for some time. It was a no-brainer that we'd want Larry for the 1980 edition of the series. He had great recall and was one of those X-Factor guys, charismatic and entertaining. He was an engaging storyteller and would shine in the Timeline format with me dangling the carrot. Larry's a real character, outside the ring also, as you're probably learning most of the guys from that era were. Larry is a worker through and through. He is responsible for the most brilliant request for an advance on his pay that I'd ever experienced. We really don't do advances on workers' pay, except for Conan, but more on that later. We just generally don't do it, and not because they're thieves or we are distrusting of talent, except for Conan, but more on that later. There are simply so many variables to some of these bookings that if they fall apart for whatever reason, everyone can walk away with minimal inconvenience. After a few emails back and forth with Larry Zbyszko to go over the details of the booking, he gives me a call about 2 weeks before the shoot. After some small talk that guarantees me a detailed and insightful show about WWE in the year 1980, Larry says the following. "Listen, Sean, something's going on with my teeth." "What's that, Larry?" I asked. "Well, they're chipping and I'm spitting pieces of teeth all over the place. Getting old sucks, man. My damn teeth are falling apart. I really want to get some new ones before your shoot. I don't want my teeth falling out for your show." Brilliant. It's now up to me to save my show. His teeth are now my problem. Surely I'd pay to save our show. "I was wondering if you could send me a few bucks to get them fixed." Bam. Right there. Well, wouldn't you? It was an advance on what we would be paying anyway. Still, you have to admire Larry's booking of his advance. Larry showed up with a beautiful mouthful of teeth, and he was phenomenal in the show. I was happy to help both he and his dentist. I mentioned earlier that we had benchmark names that had to be a part of the series, like Zbyszko. Ultimately, though, if we couldn't come to terms with someone, we'd have to move on. Negotiations are fairly simple for me, and if the price doesn't work, it doesn't work, period. Then there are other times a talent just doesn't want to do a shoot interview. That term, shoot interview, has a negative connotation for some, and I wish that more talent would see that the shoot interview subgenre has a lot of different gradients. One of the names I considered a must-have was Roddy Piper. Piper was the heel that helped make Hulk Hogan and the WWE's boom period in the mid-'80s. When we locked him in to cover 1984 for Timeline, the history of WWE, I was excited. This year was the biggie as far as I was concerned. 1984 set the stage for a lineage of things to come, not the least of which was the first WrestleMania. Piper was integral in selling that landmark show. For total disclosure, I should admit that it cannot be overstated how much of a Piper mark I was as a kid. I was Piper for Halloween in 6th grade, but I was Piper for my childhood, much to my parents' dismay. Couldn't I have looked up to Terry Bradshaw, G.I. Joe, O.J. Simpson? No way. I had never seen anyone use their mouth to move so many people. Sure, they wanted to strangle him, but what a visceral reaction. It was a gift. It meant being noticed, though hated. It meant mattering to people. That's heavy shit for a kid looking to be noticed. Roddy was quite the performer in our interview setting as well. His dramatic pauses and keen, instinctual identification of moments is second to none. It's why Roddy was captivating in the ring, in the promo, in Hollywood, and on Timeline, the history of WWE. For over 3 hours, Roddy went right with me through everything and anything I brought up. It was one of those times where I wasn't hosting, I was chatting. The script and the clock were almost inconsequential. I was getting the straight dish, kind of, from Hot Rod. I say kind of because Roddy always blurred reality a bit. But I was certain I was getting the truth about everything I wanted. Plus, I didn't know if Roddy was intentionally exaggerating details. It's quite possible that everything Roddy told me is exactly as he remembered it. We talked for over 3 hours and covered this landmark year, and yet the one thing that has outlived the importance of that entire show is a single murky revelation about Pat Patterson and a young Roddy at the Olympic Auditorium. The implication was big, and that moment got noticed all over the place, particularly in a large building in Stamford, Connecticut. We didn't go to any lengths to hide it. As a matter of fact, part of it was in the official trailer. Roddy's revelation was significant, and it was undoubtedly a selling point for the show. It was intriguing and moved Roddy a great deal while discussing it, but he stopped short of being explicit. Was it true? Was it irresponsible to put this in the show? No, I didn't think so. Actually, was what irresponsible to put in the show? The only concrete statements about the situation with Pat that came from Roddy's mouth were that he was a pretty kid at one time, and he may have did something to Pat, and it was awkward. All of this was an outgrowth of my asking about Pat as a booker, and Roddy offering that Pat didn't like him. When I asked why, Piper had this confessional moment. While those are the only incriminating statements made in that part of the interview, it's something Roddy said later that was more telling. Roddy patted my leg at one point later on and jokingly asked me what I was doing later. "Not working the Olympic Auditorium in 1972, that's for sure," I replied. Roddy laughed and said, "And I brought knee pads. Who knew he'd become the boss?" Do the work on your own. The word I got was that WWE was angry at Roddy after this moment on our show. I have no idea if they did any due diligence to find out if anything actually happened to Roddy while he was a young wrestler that may have scarred him. I just know his mouth was a threat to their publicly traded empire. Pun intended. Any anger directed at Roddy pissed me off. Roddy did not point a finger into the camera and spell out specific charges at Pat, like some other folks did circa 1992. Roddy actually assumed blame, painting himself like he did something stupid as a kid. I'm not sure that's necessarily the healthiest thing to do either, but to be mad at him for having a moment while exploring a painful memory is bullshit and a selfish stance. Moments like this are confirmation that historical retellings by WWE Network and any other shareholder-approved outlets wherein truth is secondary to liability will never be able to compete with ours. Having said all that, I'm not sure about Roddy's recollection being true, or at least having occurred as he stated. The timeline is weird, and I'm not sure they crossed paths in LA, as Pat spent most of his time in San Francisco for promoter Roy Shire. I don't know Roddy to have worked San Francisco, but who the hell am I to argue? I can say one thing, details to be debated perhaps. Roddy felt what he was saying. Something went down between he and Pat. Who knows what? In the WWE-produced show Legends House, which aired after our interview with Roddy but was taped beforehand, both he and Pat had to share a house with some other wrestling talent. I kept a keen eye on Roddy's and Pat's interaction on that reality show when it aired. He and Pat barely interacted with each other on camera. A couple of years after our work together, on July 31st, 2015, the world lost the greatest wrestling heel ever to hold a microphone. Roddy Piper had a heart attack in his sleep and shocked the wrestling world for the very last time.